Ji, Assalamu alaikum. This is Dr. Anil Salman, Chair Economic Security at EPRI, Islamabad. And today we have one of the renowned environmentalists from USA, and his name is Dr. Salim Ali, who is a Blue Gold Distinguished Professor at University of Delaware, USA. He has already been associated with University of Vermont in Australia, and he has some classic books, and I'm sure all of you must have seen his research in terms of the articles, in terms of books, and his op-eds or National Geographic में भी इनके pieces आए हैं. And today we are fortunate enough he's here in Pakistan at EPRI Studio, and where we are going to ask some certain pertinent questions regarding environment. Ji, Assalamu alaikum, Doctor Sir.
Walaikum assalam, ji, Dr. Neil.
How are you?
Good, thanks for the
And I hope
invitation.
you are having a good time in Pakistan with lots and lots of talks as
Ji,
you are here in
cool,
town.
cool. It's really lovely to be back, and intellectual exercises with scholars like you are always a pleasure.
Thank you. I just have 2-3 questions where I want के हमारे यहाँ पे पाकिस्तान में एक भी in the over the past few months Indus Water Treaty के ऊपर there has been a lot of discussion about it. And water has always been seen as a conflict. But when we look at Pakistan and India and how the water resource management has been taking place, is it still a conflict or is it a connection between the two countries?
Well, I think water, if you think of it in terms of the quantity of water that is needed by either side, then it can be a source of conflict, because if you have a finite resource and one side is using it and the other is deprived of it, it can lead to conflict. That especially happens with rivers, because rivers are asymmetric. You have rivers flowing from one country to another. The upstream riparian has more power compared to the downstream riparian, and that can lead to conflict. However, if you have water as a shared resource in the form of a lake or an aquifer with groundwater, then it can be a source of cooperation, because the quality of the water, if it gets impaired, then everyone suffers. So if you have a lake that's polluted, everyone's going to suffer. If it's an aquifer which is polluted, everyone suffers. So it depends on the kind of water resource. And in the case of India and Pakistan, because it's primarily riparian issues, and there is a clear power asymmetry in terms of the water flowing largely from India downstream into Pakistan, that leads to a sense of conflict. That's why we had the Indus Waters Treaty as a means of trying to resolve that.
But why, like even in your talk when you were sharing, the Indus Water Treaty was more of a mere distribution and the environmental lens was not kept in mind.
Yes.
But is it true when we are looking at Rhine River or when we're looking at Nile that the same kind of environmental lens was also ignored, or it was very much there?
Yes, so in the case of the Indus Waters Treaty, it was negotiated essentially by the World Bank, and there was an engineer from the Tennessee Valley Authority in the US, David Lilienthal. So he was brought in really to look at it from the water distribution perspective. And as an engineer, his solution was build dams and divide up the water. He didn't look at what would be the impact on the ecology of the system when you did that, whether it was with building dams or it was in terms of the distribution canals and so on. So environmental factors were not part of the equation when it was negotiated. Some of the more recent treaties and also some of the addenda to treaties in Europe have brought in more environmental approaches, the Danube particularly, and to some degree the Rhine as well. And there is much more concern about what would be the impact on wetlands if you were to build a certain kind of dam or impoundment. What are the long-term impacts on hydrology of the system? And I think that's what we need to bring in. Plus, the other additional factor is climate change and vulnerability with water security concerns of the downstream riparian. In the case of Pakistan, we have an argument to be made that we are a very vulnerable country in terms of climate change and extreme weather events. So we need to have some assurance in terms of just human security aspects of water. And that's where the reforms of the treaty should progress.
A one-liner, when we say, yes, we are a vulnerable nation, is that, वो जिसे कहते हैं ना, a kind of card that we play so that we can get more money, or do you think the Pakistani environment is so
Well, I
fragile?
mean, there can always be that cynicism about any kind of sense of deprivation that's conveyed. But I think objective analyses have shown that Pakistan is very vulnerable to climate change because of a range of factors. One is because we depend a lot on meltwater from glaciers. In terms of the way in which the water availability plays out. Second is also the monsoons and extreme weather events at certain times of the year, which will be impacted by climate change. So the data is very clear on that aspect. That's why we're very vulnerable. And that's something that has been recognized in terms of objective indices of vulnerability. Now, how we use that is up to us, whether we just use it in a very disingenuous way to get donor money, or we actually make some improvements in terms of our own efficiency mechanisms, using water better, as well as looking at the total way in which our infrastructure is managed. Whether we are losing water to evaporation in certain cases, whether our dams infrastructure is aging. So I think there is a genuine concern, but we also need to make sure we make internal changes and not just rely on external donors.
Uh, Given you stayed in Pakistan, an HSonian, then going to MIT and Yale, so you know the both worlds. My question to you is that how do you see climate activism or environmental activism evolved in Pakistan over these years? Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Or do you think it's just more of an plastic representation कि जी पाकिस्तान बहुत कुछ कर रहा है? Or do you really feel that as a country we have moved forward in climate activism?
Yes, no, I think actually Pakistan has had a very distinguished history of environmental activism, and what's surprising is that some of our industrialists have been very involved in it, like Syed Babar Ali, who was the head of WWF, president of WWF many years ago, was an industrialist. We've had many important chapters of these organizations like IUCN at one time, the International Union for Conservation of Nature. The Pakistan chapter was among the largest in South Asia. So we do have a lot of history of environmental learning and advocacy. It has not always translated into a much broader national awareness mechanism in policy circles. And that's what needs to change. And it is also slowly changing. Pakistan played a leadership role in the last climate change COP meeting, the Convention of the Parties, where Pakistan led the negotiations on a loss damage waiver fund for extreme disasters. And we continue to be very active in environmental caucuses at organizations like the World Trade Organization. So I think we have a good record, but it's such a daunting challenge with our population, with our range of issues that we have to consider. Wastewater treatment, for example, huge problem. Urban sanitation issues, which is also linked to disease. Air quality, as we know, Lahore particularly is often one of the most polluted cities in the world in terms of air quality rankings. So there are multiple problems, but we have the human capital to address it. We just need to make sure there's greater policy interface with that human capital.
And how do you see role of Pakistan in COP28 with reference to would there be any positive change that we should expect? Like last year, we talked about the loss and damage
Yes.
fund, but this year, what are the expectations?
Well, a lot of the emphasis will be on climate financing more broadly at COP28. There is also concern about the targets that have been set and whether there will be the ability of developing countries to meet those targets for mitigation also. The coal sector is the biggest concern in that regard, and Pakistan is, because we are still quite reliant on fossil fuels for our energy. That's going to be part of the concern. The fact that COP28 is being held in the United Arab Emirates has raised some eyebrows because that's a country that was developed through fossil fuel economy. But I don't think that should be a concern overall, because they have shown a lot of commitment to new technologies for mitigation. Pakistan could play a role because we have a very large diaspora in UAE. We've got very good connections with the UAE government, which is the host. So I hope that there's a greater emphasis on technology transfer for mitigation as well as adaptation. The fund has been established. You have other climate finance mechanisms, which will be a lot of the dominating conversation, but I hope there's more on technology transfer. And under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, there is the CTCN, it's called the Climate Technology Center Network, that's based in Copenhagen. I think that has an opportunity to be further leveraged to help Pakistan, and I hope there are further conversations at COP28 about that as well.
Very well said. But in most of the public debates, when we are talking about climate finance, either it's mitigation or an adaptation. But most of the projects that go for bidding or for the funding that are related to adaptation.
Yes.
And the confusion gets on that if it is adaptation, they think that's development. But the most of the funding that are being given to the countries, they actually go for the mitigation projects.
Yes.
But Pakistan submit the adaptation projects.
Yeah.
How that anomaly can be solved, or how we can convince this is basically climate change?
Well, the problem is that, the climate financing went primarily for mitigation because countries were afraid of what we call the moral hazard problem.
Right.
That if you actually start engaging in adaptation, people will not reduce emissions.
Exactly.
So now I think we've past a tipping point where there's recognition that the climate is going to change irreversibly to a point where we do need to support adaptation if we are to prevent massive disruptions. So I think you will see a real shift in climate financing going more towards adaptation as well. And in that regard, Pakistan is well suited. Under the Green Climate Fund, we have some projects.
Yes.
Recharge Pakistan is a really good project, which is focused on using existing basins where water can be channeled during extreme weather events, so that instead of building a dam, you have a natural depression and you build canal infrastructure and the water gets diverted there, so you don't get flooding in populated areas. That's a Green Climate Fund project. And so these are the kinds of efforts which we should be further advocating, because at this stage, mitigation, especially with the development imperative, where energy is already a major concern for Pakistan's economic growth. We do need reliable energy. And at least for the foreseeable future, we will have fossil fuels playing a transition role in Pakistan's energy economy until we are able to develop other sources for baseload power. So that's what we should be advocating at COP28.
Right. My last question to you. In 2003, I believe you came up with this concept, or you started advocating this PeaceParks.
Mm-hmm.
As we are in 2023, is it a practical concept, or is it still a theoretical concept?
No, I think it's very practical, and in fact, the discussion we had earlier today at IPRI, where there will be, the audience can see the video of the conversation around that too. I think, especially with this, the Indus Delta, that region having a peace park shared with India would make a lot of sense, because both countries are signatories to the Ramsar Convention, and they could have it done in a very neutral way, as a way of meeting their obligations to an existing environmental treaty. And then that would also help resolve the Sir Creek dispute, which is a territorial dispute. So I do think it's just a matter of having leadership and political capital invested in resolving these issues, and a peace park can be a very win-win solution. You can have both sides who can say, look, we are doing this for the greater good of the environment. We are able to share the resource in that particular conservation zone. And there are examples of that from many parts of the world. In Southern Africa, we have the PeaceParks Foundation. We have in South America several peace parks, like the Cordillera del Condor between Ecuador and Peru. You have the La Amistad International Peace Park in Panama. So there's several of these examples which we can use to further the agenda in that regard.
But we don't have Pakistan and India over there.
Not yet. Yeah, I know. I hope that there can be greater. But I should mention, Ecuador, Peru had a huge territorial conflict. They fought wars over that area, so they were able to achieve a peace treaty on a specific conservation zone. So I'm hoping that in very small scale, like Sir Creek, you could have a peace park that would be serving both sides, and they can do it in a way which is very much within their international treaty obligations.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salim. Always a treat to listening to you and the new innovative ideas in the environmental domain. Thank you very much for watching this video, and stay tuned for the next upcoming one.